I kept the key for 37 years. It still sits in the top drawer of my nightstand on the same strip of leather cord Gerald Harwick's ranch foreman gave me when I was hired. A flat steel key, about 3 inches long with a shallow notch cut near the bow so you could find it by touch in the dark. I have found it by touch in the dark more times than I can count. Some nights I wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning and I just need to know it is still there, that it was real, that I am not the kind of man who imagines things. I am 77 years old. I live in Chelan, Washington, in a house above the lake where the hills on both sides come down steep and the water is so clear you can see bottom in 20 feet of depth. My wife Ruth and I have been in this house since 2003. The apple orchards run up the ridge behind us, and in May, when the trees are flowering, the whole valley smells like a thing you would want to live inside of forever. Most people in Chelan who know me at all know me as the man who ran a hardware store on Wooden Avenue for over 2 decades and coached youth baseball for 12 years and drove a green Ford pickup until it had 240,000 miles on it and then drove another green Ford pickup. What none of them know is what I did before I came to Chelan, what I saw in an old dairy barn on a ranch outside Concanully, Washington, in the fall and winter of 1987 and into the spring of 1988, and why I was the only man on that property who ever stopped being afraid of what was inside it. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and whether you've ever had an encounter you couldn't explain. Drop it in the comments. I read everyone. Gerald Harwick died in 2011 of a stroke alone in the ranch house where he had interviewed me 23 years before. His son Paul, who had been living in Seattle and had never shared his father's interests, inherited the property and drove out to settle the estate. He spent about a week on the ranch. Within 6 months of his father's death, Paul had arranged for the facility to be disassembled. By facility, I mean the converted dairy barn with its steel-reinforced holding pen and its two-padlock gate system and every modification Harwick had spent his family money on in the decade before my arrival. The steel plate came off the interior walls, the welded pipe gate was torched at the hinges and hauled away on a flatbed. The concrete pad was broken up and the debris buried. Grass was seeded over the disturbed ground, and by the following spring, there was nothing visible from the county road except a field sloping down towards Salmon Creek and the ponderosa pines running up the ridge to the east, the same pines that had been there since before anyone in either of our families was born. Gerald's non-disclosure agreement, which I signed in late September of 1987, covered disclosure of the facility's existence and contents to the public, to any scientific institution, and to any competitor in what Gerald euphemistically called the private cryptobiological research sector. My lawyer, a man in Okanagan named Ralph Dixon, whom I consulted in 2013, read the agreement carefully and told me that it did not extend to my personal account of what I witnessed and experienced as an employee, and that, given the passage of time and the death of the principal party, enforcement would be both practically difficult and legally questionable. A second attorney, a woman in Chelan named Patty Simmons, confirmed this assessment in 2019. I am telling you now, and I am telling you everything I know. The ranch was called the Harwick property, which is what everyone in Okanagan County called it, the way rural communities name things by family rather than by formal designation, because it had been in the Harwick family since 1922. Gerald had inherited it from his father, Walter, who had run it as a cattle operation through the 30s and 40s and who had inherited it from his own father, a man named Edwin Harwick, who had homesteaded that section of the Salmon Creek drainage in the years just after the turn of the century. The cattle were long gone by 1987. Most of the outbuildings had been repurposed or abandoned. Gerald was 61 years old, recently widowed. His wife Eleanor had died of cancer in 1984 and had been spending the better part of a decade and what I later estimated from fragments Carl Watkins let slip over the years to be somewhere between $3 and $5 million of his family's timber money on a private obsession that he never once called what it actually was. Not in any conversation I was part of, not in any document I was ever shown. He called it his research program. He called it his specimen acquisition initiative. He called the thing in the barn his subject. He never called it Bigfoot. I was born in Brewster, Washington on March the 2nd, 1948, in the same small town on the Columbia River, where my grandfather had settled after coming west from North Dakota in 1929. Brewster is an orchard town, the kind of place where generations of families stayed because the river and the fruit trees and the surrounding country provided a life that required hard work but rewarded it plainly. My father, Lloyd Cooper, worked in the packing sheds for 30 years and then managed one for 8 more before his back finally made him stop. My mother, Edna, kept the house and raised me and my older sister, Carol, and attended First Baptist and grew the best tomatoes in the county according to anyone who ate them. We were ordinary people in an ordinary place, and I was grateful for it then and more grateful for it now. I finished high school in '66 and went to work almost immediately. College was not the assumed next step in Brewster in 1966, not for kids from families like mine, and I had no particular calling for it anyway. I had good hands and a good back and the kind of disposition that is comfortable with physical work, and my father's friend Dale Morrison had a small construction crew working framing jobs across Okanagan County, and Dale took me on in the summer after graduation, and I stayed in construction for the next 20 years. I moved to Tonasket in '71 because there was more work there, and I stayed in Tonasket off and on through the '70s and '80s, leaving for stretches when the work took me elsewhere in the valley and coming back, because Tonasket was where I knew people and where the rent on a room at Mrs. Engel's boarding house was $60 a month and included breakfast on weekdays. By 1987, I was 39 years old, and my right shoulder had developed the chronic rotator cuff problem that comes from 2 decades of overhead framing and roof work. It was not disabling, but it was persistent, and the kind of labor that had kept me employed and paid for 20 years was becoming harder to sustain at the same pace. I was not worried about money exactly, but I was aware of the horizon of the question. I had saved a few $1,000s. I had no particular plan. When my foreman on a Tonasket job, a man named Carl Watkins, who I had worked with periodically over the years, told me in early September of '87 that Gerald Harwick was looking for a reliable overnight man for his ranch property, was paying cash, and didn't require a formal work history, just a reference from someone who vouched for you. I listened with more interest than I would have 6 months earlier. Carl and I were in the habit of eating lunch at the same diner on the main road through Tonasket when we were on the same job. He told me about the Harwick work over a plate of eggs on a Tuesday. He said the work was simple. Nighttime security at Harwick's property, 6 nights a week, 10 to 6, watching an outbuilding and making sure nothing went wrong. He said Harwick was particular about reliability and discretion and had asked Carl to recommend someone who had both in solid measure. He said the pay was $450 a week in cash. I said I was interested. Carl said he'd pass the word. I drove out to the Harwick Ranch on a Friday afternoon in late September. The property is northeast of Concanully, which is a small community about 12 miles north of Omak at the north end of the Okanagan Valley. The road from Concanully that leads towards Salmon Creek and the highlands above it winds up through a country of dry ponderosa pine and bunch grass that transitions, as you gain elevation, into denser timber where Douglas fir comes in and the air acquires a character that feels different from the valley floor. The Okanagan Highlands are the kind of terrain that people who grew up in western Washington don't always register as wilderness because it doesn't look dramatic the way the Cascades look dramatic. But they are substantial and remote in a way that the numbers on a map don't convey until you are in them. The Colville National Forest covers most of the country northeast of the Okanogan River, and it runs east to the Kettle River Range and north toward the Canadian border, without much interruption from roads or towns. There are places in there that the Forest Service has not visited on foot in years. When I made that drive in September of '87, the Okanogan Highlands were exactly the kind of country where a being could live at a genuine distance from human observation and be sustained in that distance indefinitely. The Okanogan Highlands sit on a fault in the public imagination between 2 different versions of the Pacific Northwest. Most people, when they think of Washington state wilderness, think of the Cascades, the volcanoes, the old-growth rainforest on the wet side, the dramatic topography that photographers have been reproducing on calendars for decades. The Okanogan country on the eastern slope is a different register entirely, drier, more open in the lower elevations, a country of dry bunch grass and ponderosa pine that transitions at altitude into the denser, mixed conifer forests of the highlands. The Okanagan River drains a long north-south valley between two elevated plateaus, and the terrain above that valley, both east and west, has the quality of country that was not made for easy human navigation. Not because the individual features are extreme, but because they compound. Ridge after ridge, canyon after canyon, the roads running out and the horse trails running out after them, and then just the land itself, which has been the same land for a very long time and has no particular interest in being traversed. The Colville National Forest covers approximately 1.5 million acres in the northeastern corner of Washington state, running from the Okanogan River east to the Idaho border and north toward Canada. Within that acreage, there are places that have not been visited by a human being in years. Not because the terrain is impassable, most of it is not, but because there is no reason to go there, no trail maintained, no resource being managed, no destination that draws a visitor. The wilderness database maintained by the Forest Service logs roughly 1,100 miles of maintained trail across the Colville, which sounds substantial until you look at the map and see how much country exists between those trails. The untrailed country is where the deer populations are largest and where the elk winter in the draws below the ridgelines, and where, according to a database of sighting reports I have read in some depth since 1988, the evidence of another kind of large mammal is most consistently found. I have looked at that database over the years with the specific interest of someone who spent 8 months in close proximity to a member of whatever species it documents. The BFRO, the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, maintains a searchable database of reported encounters organized by county and state. Okanagan County, Washington has 47 reports logged as of the last time I checked. That is not a large number across a county of nearly 5,000 square miles, but almost all of them, when I map them against the topography I know, cluster in the same general zone, the high country north of the Okanogan River, the Salmon Creek drainage, the Colville National Forest land east and northeast of Conconully. The zone I have been describing. The zone where she pressed her palm against the north wall of the barn on cold nights. I am not presenting this as proof of anything. I am presenting it as context because the story of what happened in that barn does not exist in a vacuum, and context is part of understanding. October was the month when I truly began to know her in the limited but real way that you can know a being you are not permitted to speak to directly and who communicates through means that your sensory apparatus and your conceptual framework were not built to receive without effort. I began to know her through accumulation, through the nightly record in my composition notebook, which by October had grown to 40 dense pages of observation, description, and the kind of analysis that a man with no formal scientific training produces when he applies his best attention to what he cannot look away from. Harwick met me on the porch of his house. He was a large man, not heavy, but big-framed, with white hair gone yellow at the temples and hands that looked like they had done outdoor work for most of their life. He wore a canvas shirt and work pants and boots that had seen real use, and he carried himself with the particular ease of a man who has been in charge of his own circumstances for a long time. He looked me over in the assessing way that ranchers and contractors look over job candidates. Thorough rather than rude, checking a structure for visible flaws before deciding whether to trust it with weight. He asked me 3 questions. He asked whether I owned a firearm. I told him yes, a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson Model 10 revolver I had carried since I was 22, when my father gave it to me as a practical gift on the occasion of my first solo construction job. He asked whether I drank on the job. I told him no. He asked whether I had ever violated a professional confidence for money or to avoid trouble. I told him no to that too, and I told it to him directly, which I think was what he was actually assessing. Not the content of the answer, but the quality of the delivery. He nodded and described the position. Night watch, 6 nights a week, 10 in the evening until 6 in the morning. There was a subject in an outbuilding that required regular monitoring. If the subject became agitated in any way that suggested containment might be compromised, I was to call a number on a card he would give me and wait outside the building. Under no circumstances was I to attempt to intervene directly or to enter the containment area. I asked what kind of subject. He looked at me for a long time, long enough that I thought he was going to redirect the conversation. Then he said it was a research subject of an undisclosed species acquired through legal channels, and the specifics were proprietary. He said if I took the position, I would be required to sign a non-disclosure agreement before being given access to the facility. He said the agreement was comprehensive and was not a formality. I said I understood. I signed it that afternoon at his kitchen table, witnessed by Carl. 3 pages. I did not read every word, which is not something I recommend to anyone, but I needed the money, and I had made my assessment of the man, and Carl walked me out to the barn. It was late September. The cottonwoods along Salmon Creek already turned yellow in the low places, the air smelling of dry grass and the faint wood smoke of someone's fire down the valley, a sharpness in the cold as we climbed toward the barn that told you fall had already claimed this elevation. The main barn was concrete block and Douglas fir, built in 1948, as I noted from the date poured into the lintel above the main door, 120 feet long and 40 feet wide, with a corrugated metal roof that the years had oxidized to dark orange-brown. Carl unlocked the outer door and swung it open, and I followed, and the smell hit me before my eyes had adjusted. There is no clean way to describe it. Musky, animal, dense, but underneath that a green quality, like crushed pine needles and damp earth, layered over the heavier base, the way cedar lining a chest modifies what is stored inside it. It was not a stench. It was an overwhelming presence. The smell of a presence very large and very alive in an enclosed space, saturating every particle of air in the barn so completely that by the time my eyes had found the source, the smell had already told me that whatever was back there was nothing I had ever been in a room with. She was standing at the far end of the pen. I say she because that is what I came to understand over time, and I will explain how. At that first moment, all I could see was size and shape and 2 eyes reflecting the weak overhead bulb. She was upright, fully bipedal, with her back against the steel-plated rear wall, and her hands, I registered them almost immediately. They caught the eye before the mind had a category for them, too large for a human's hands by a margin that the eye understood before the brain caught up, hanging loose at her sides. She was looking at me, not scanning, not glancing, looking, with a stillness and directness that is difficult to describe because it had a quality of attention that exceeded what I was prepared for. Not aggression, not threat, closer to assessment but not purely clinical, an attention that included what I had not expected, the sense that she was evaluating not just what I was but what I was likely to be. Carl said she won't do anything as long as you don't go near the gate. He said it the way he said everything related to the facility. Neutral, procedural, worn smooth by repetition. She ate this morning, he said. She's calm tonight. Some nights she isn't. You'll learn to tell the difference. I asked Carl how tall she was. He said his best estimate, based on comparisons with the steel panel sections she sometimes stood against, was 7 feet 3 inches. He said the capture team had weighed her at approximately 650 pounds during the initial acquisition process, and that she had lost weight since then. He said this without expression, the way a man says a thing he has said often enough that the emotional content of it has been smoothed away. I want to tell you what I want to tell you about the first night before I go further. I was afraid. Not the screaming, adrenaline-spiked fear of encountering the unexpected without preparation, because I had been told enough to brace myself for what was extraordinary, a quieter fear, the fear that comes from the uncategorizable. The fear that runs underneath explicit threat and addresses itself to the part of you that has spent its whole life sorting the world into things that fit the known map and things that don't, and encountering what categorically doesn't has a physical quality to it that is distinct from anything else. I sat in the chair Carl had set up just inside the outer barn door at the folding table with my thermos and whatever I had brought to read, and I was afraid for most of the first week. Not constantly, not at a level that impaired function, but persistently. The way you are afraid of what sits at the edge of your vision that you cannot quite bring yourself to look at directly. I kept my eyes on my book. I kept the thermos within reach, and gradually, night by night, the fear did what fear does when nothing bad happens to sustain it. It softened. It became vigilance and then attention, and attention became, almost without my noticing the transition, a different kind of looking. The transition took approximately 10 days, which I can date with some confidence because I was keeping the notebook by the second week, and the notebook tells me when the quality of my entries changed. The first entries read like the record of a man trying to make the very large fit inside a manageable frame. They list details with the slightly pressured specificity of someone who is using description as a hedge against what description cannot contain. Height, estimated 7 to 7.5 feet. Weight, substantial, difficult to estimate, certainly 400 pounds minimum, probably more. Hair, dark brown to near black in the available light. Behavior, predominantly stationary monitoring. Attitude toward observer, no direct acknowledgement. I was writing around what I was seeing rather than into it. By the second week, the entries changed. They got longer. They started trying to reach the thing the first entries had been writing around. This is when I first wrote the word she. Not the subject, not the animal, not the specimen, she. Not because I had made any decision about personhood or status or any of the categories that were going to become impossible to avoid thinking about later. It was just what she was. The notebook knew it before I had the argument with myself about it. The notebook was less defended than I was. The fear, as it thinned out over those first nights, left behind what I did not have a precise word for at the time. I have since arrived at the word witness, not observer, which implies a distance and a boundary that was already dissolving. Witness, which implies being changed by what you see. A witness is not separate from the event. A witness is part of it. I was becoming part of what was happening in that barn, and I did not yet understand how completely.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, links down below. And let's get you back to the video.
The first thing I learned about her across the first month of watching was that her behavior was not binary in the way Carl's categories implied. Carl had described the observational framework in terms of calm nights and agitated nights, and his nightly log confirmed this. The behavioral state of the subject was calm, agitated, feeding, sleeping, or pacing, and these 5 words exhausted the field. In practice, what I observed was considerably more nuanced than any of those 5 could capture. She had moods in the truest sense, not the fluctuating emotional states of a stressed captive, though stress was present as a permanent background condition, but the genuine variances of a being with an interior life that responded to its circumstances with complexity. She was calmer on rainy nights, noticeably so in a way I began to track within the first 3 weeks. The Okanagan gets less precipitation than the west side of the Cascades, but gets real rain in fall and winter, and on nights when rain moved in and hit the corrugated overhang above the barn's south side, the quality of her stillness changed. On ordinary, quiet nights she was still, but it was the stillness of containment. Muscles held against a weight, the kinetic energy of a large body managing itself within a small space. On rain nights, the containment quality dropped away. She would sit, not slump, but with her back straight and her hands resting on her knees, and her face would angle slightly upward, and she would stay that way for long stretches, listening. The rain was telling her what it needed to, or reminding her of what it carried, and she was receiving it with her full attention. She was agitated on nights when the wind came from the north and the northwest. I watched this pattern for 4 weeks before I was certain it was consistent and not coincidental. On nights when the temperature dropped and the wind shifted out of the Okanagan highlands north of the river, she paced, not frantic, not the desperate repetitive movement of a confined animal grinding its distress into a worn path. Her pacing had direction to it. She moved along the perimeter of the pen in a circuit, and every time the circuit brought her to the north wall, she stopped. She placed one palm flat against the steel plate and held it there for several seconds with her face close to the wall and her eyes closed. Then she continued. She would do this for hours steadily with a patience that was almost meditational, and I came to understand, not through any dramatic revelation, but through the accumulation of many nights of watching, that she was tracking a signal through the steel and the timber and the miles of high country air. Some signal that came with the north wind, a call from whatever territory she had been taken from, and that reached her even through 2 inches of steel plate and 60 feet of old Douglas fir wall. She was oriented toward a point outside the barn. She was listening toward it. She was keeping the line open to it by whatever means she had available, which was her body pressed against the closest surface between herself and it. I did not tell Carl this. I arrived at 6 every morning, handed off the keys, answered his questions about the night with the 5-category shorthand his log required, and drove back to my room in Tonasket. Carl came on at 6, checked the pen, made his entry in the behavioral log, and went about his day. He was a careful man who had learned through whatever process a person goes through when they need to function in close proximity to what their worldview cannot accommodate, not to ask questions that would require answers he couldn't live with. I respected that, but it was not my response. My response, from about the 3rd week, was to start keeping my own record. Harwick himself came to observe on Sunday mornings, which was the only time I overlapped with him. He arrived between 10 and 10:30 before Carl's shift ended and stayed for an hour or two. He brought his own notebook, a proper field notebook, leather-bound, the kind you can buy at scientific supply stores, and he sat in a folding chair near the pen gate and wrote in small, precise handwriting and did not speak to her and did not speak much to Carl or to me. He looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he has staked everything on solving and cannot quite reach. What I noticed about Harwick's observation sessions, watching them from my chair near the door as I waited out the tail end of my shift, was that he never saw her, he saw his data. He saw the behavioral evidence he was trying to generate or the absence of it. He watched her move and he made notes about the movement, and the notes were careful and precise and captured everything except the thing that was most visible. She was watching him back. Every Sunday morning, while he sat with his field notebook and recorded her behavior, she was conducting her own parallel assessment from across 30 feet of steel-penned space. She had developed over the months before I arrived a specific Sunday morning behavior that was distinct from every other behavioral mode I observed at any other time. She was quieter, more still. She sat against the north wall with a posture that appeared to be resting but was not resting, a posture of deliberate attention held at a controlled distance, the posture of someone managing the quality of what they reveal to a specific observer. She was calibrating what she showed him. I do not know whether Harwick ever understood that what he was observing on those Sunday mornings was not her natural behavior but her curated response to his observation, that the data he was so carefully recording was data she was generating with a specific intent. She had figured out across 14 months of captivity and his weekly visits exactly what he was looking for, and had decided not to give it to him. What she gave him instead every Sunday morning was a 7'3", being sitting quietly against a north wall, which recorded in his field notebook as calm, stationary, disengaged from observer. A data point that told him nothing and that she had designed to tell him nothing. She was writing his field notes for him, and she was writing them to say what she chose. I found this, when I finally understood it, to be the most impressive thing I had ever witnessed. I bought a composition notebook at the Tonasket drugstore, not to fulfill any requirement. I bought it because watching her and not writing about what I was watching felt like waste. The drive back from the ranch to Tonasket each morning took 40 minutes on a good road through country that looked different in early light than it did in the dark of the drive out. I used those 40 minutes the way you use transition time when you are carrying something heavy, not to process it exactly, but to set it gently down in the part of your mind where things wait to be understood, so that the rest of you can function through the hours until the next shift. I made the drive, stopped at the diner on the main road for eggs and coffee, drove to Mrs. Engel's, and slept from 9 until 3 in the afternoon. Woke up and read for a couple of hours and then drove back. 6 days a week for 8 months. The diner, Mrs. Engel's, the notebook, the drive. I had never kept a journal of any kind before that fall. I was not a man who had considered himself to have an interior life demanding documentation. I had worked, paid my bills, kept my tools in good order, gone hunting in the fall, played cards with friends on weekends, the life of a man who finds what he needs in activity and company in the physical world and does not particularly need to sit alone with his thoughts. That changed. The barn made it change. What I was seeing in the barn required more space than the drive and the eggs and the sleep could provide, and the notebook gave it that space. By November, I was writing 2 or 3 pages a night on slow nights, and 4 or 5 on nights when something happened that needed to be held at the length of full sentences to be understood. The notebook became the container for what the shift could not contain. And reading it back across the weeks and months, I could see things I could not see in individual nights. Patterns, developments, a relationship taking shape through the cumulative record of small exchanges and changes. The notebook was how I knew what was happening between us. Without it, I might have missed most of it. I had been a noticer my whole life. My mother had said it. I was the kind of child who watched a room before he entered it. In that barn, watching was all I had to offer, and I was going to offer it as completely as I could. What I noticed in that first month beyond the rain and the wind patterns was that she was watching me too. This seems obvious when stated. Of course, a captive being monitors the humans in proximity, but what I mean is more specific than reflexive awareness of a nearby body. She was studying me, the way you study what you are trying to understand, what not because survival requires it, but because you are curious, because your mind is built for inquiry and meets the genuinely new, and does what minds built for inquiry do. The first clear evidence of this came in the 4th week. I was reading when I sneezed. A hard, involuntary sneeze that knocked my thermos off the table edge and sent it rolling across the concrete floor with a noise that was considerable in the quiet of the barn at 2 in the morning. I picked it up, checked the lid, settled back into my chair. When I looked up, she had moved from the far wall to the side of the pen nearest me, not to the gate itself, but to the pipe section between the first and second horizontal rails about 10 feet from my chair. She was standing there looking at me with an expression I have no word for except attentive. Not alarm, not aggression, concern. She was checking on me the way you look at someone who has made an unexpected sound in a quiet room to assess whether they are all right. I sat very still for a moment and then said out loud, just dropped my coffee. She stayed where she was for about 30 seconds longer, then moved back toward the north wall. The attentiveness of those 30 seconds, the specificity of it, directed at me, directed at the sound I had made, oriented toward an assessment of my well-being, was the first moment when the word I had been avoiding since the first night, curious, aware, present, was no longer sufficient on its own, and I had to find a larger word. The word I found was a word like person, a being who checks on you when you make an unexpected sound, a being who modulates its behavior to keep another being comfortable, a being who makes music for its own sake in the small hours of the morning. I am still sitting with that word. Whatever the appropriate taxonomic framework is, it is not my feel, and what I observed is what I observed, and person is the honest word for it. The other thing I learned in that first month, which I have not yet mentioned, is that she was not solitary in whatever life she had come from. I understood this not from anything she said, but from the way she moved through the pen. She had habits and patterns that suggested a social existence, a life in which her actions had been calibrated for the presence of others over a long period. When she ate to the side. When she rested, she positioned herself where she could see the full space of the pen without being seen from one specific angle. The orientation of someone accustomed to sleeping in proximity to others and managing their own position relative to the group. When she made sounds, they rose at the end in the modulation of speech addressed to a listener, not every sound, but enough that I understood the sounds were not simply self-expression. They were conversation directed at an absent audience, a practice kept alive by habit even when the audience was not there. She had a community. She had had a community for whatever decades her life had accumulated before the summer of 1986, and it was present in her as a form, even in the pen. She had worked out early in my time there that direct eye contact unsettled me. My reactions the first few times she held my gaze were probably written in small tales that most human observers would have caught. A shift in posture, a slight drop of my eyes to the floor, the adjustment of a man who needs to look away and is trying to do it without making it obvious. She caught them. Within the first 3 weeks, she had modulated her attention. She stopped holding my gaze directly. Instead, she watched me from angles, from the periphery of her gaze as she walked the perimeter, a quick look as she passed the side nearest my chair, from beneath the fall of her hair when she was sitting, and I might have assumed she was resting. She had adapted her curiosity to what I could tolerate, the way a person who cares about a conversation moderates its intensity to keep the other person in it. That adjustment, the fact that she had noticed my discomfort and changed her behavior to accommodate it, not to manipulate me, not to achieve a specific outcome, but simply because she had noticed and chose to take it into account, was the first thing she did that moved my understanding from the category of exceptional animal behavior into a category I had no clean word for yet. Harwick had told me in the hiring conversation that the subject had been acquired 14 months ago. A year is not a long time by most measures, but a year in a 30 by 30 foot steel enclosure alone is a different kind of time. The nights when I sat in my chair and thought about what a year of that would do to a human being, any human being, regardless of strength or determination, produced in me a feeling I did not at first identify correctly, but eventually recognized as shame. Not guilt, I had not put her there, but shame at being a member of the species that had. Shame at sitting in a chair at the border of it and collecting a paycheck. I tried to locate that feeling more precisely over the months I was there. It was not simple guilt, which would have been cleaner and easier to carry. Guilt has an action attached to it. If you are guilty, you stop, you repair, you restore. What I felt was more diffuse and more permanent. It was the feeling of understanding for the first time in my life, the full range of what my species was capable of, not in theory, not from a news story or a history book, in a barn 30 feet away from the evidence 6 nights a week. I had not been raised to think of humans as particularly noble. My father was a practical man, and practical men in Okanagan County do not traffic much in species-level self-congratulation, but I had also not been raised to think of humans as especially terrible. The range I understood going into that fall was the ordinary range. Most people do well enough most of the time. A few do genuinely bad things. Most of the damage in the world comes from ordinary self-interest scaled up and compounded. I understood Gerald Harwick and what he had done in those terms before I began working at the barn. He was a man pursuing his own conviction at the cost of another being's freedom. That was a version of damage I understood. What I did not understand until I was sitting in that chair watching her was the specific quality of being on the receiving end of that conviction. The way intelligence encounters its own captivity. The way a being who has never done anything except live in the country it was made for sits in a steel pen and decides every single day how to remain itself in circumstances designed to make remaining itself nearly impossible. Understanding that, watching it happen night after night, expanded the range of what I understood about what humans can do in a direction I have not been able to contract back since. I need to tell you about Gerald Harwick now, because to understand what eventually happened in that barn, you need to understand him. And understanding him requires understanding how a man like him exists. He was not a monster. I want to be very clear about that, because the easy story, the one I have heard from people when I have told fragments of this over the years, is that Harwick was simply cruel. That story is simpler than the truth, and I don't think it serves anyone, including the being he imprisoned, to flatten what happened into a shape that fits comfortably. Harwick had grown up on this land, a third-generation Okanagan County rancher. His father, Walter, had been a practical man who ran cattle and minded his business. Gerald had been different from a young age, intellectually restless in a place that treated intellectual restlessness as a liability, curious about things beyond the boundaries of the ranch and the valley and the known world. He had gone to the University of Washington in '55 and come back with a biology degree and a wife named Eleanor, and a set of questions that the surrounding country would spend the rest of his life raising, and that he would never fully answer. He was a serious man, a methodical man. He believed in evidence and documentation and the discipline of rigorous observation. He was also, I gradually understood, a man who had been humiliated, not by any single event, but by the accumulated weight of spending 20 years of his life pursuing evidence for what the scientific community regarded as nonsense. He had published 2 papers in independent research journals and been dismissed in both cases. He had presented at 2 conferences and been treated with the polite contempt that established fields reserved for outsiders who venture claims that would require rearranging the furniture. He had spent a significant portion of his family fortune on an obsession that everyone around him had advised against. What the capture was supposed to do was solve all of that, produce the proof that could not be dismissed, the living specimen that would force the scientific community to acknowledge what he had spent 20 years and millions of dollars asserting was real. That was the plan. What drove him to authorize the capture team, the helicopter, the net, the tranquilizer, that was why Gerald Harwick had a 7'3" being in a steel pen on his ranch in Okanagan County, Washington. Not malice, conviction, and an absolute refusal to accept that the thing he knew was real would continue to be called not real by people who had never walked the country where it lived. The capture had happened in late July of 1986 on Harwick's own land on the ridge above Salmon Creek. Carl Watkins, in the fragments he shared over the years, described it as a 3-day operation. A helicopter crew and 2 ground teams, one on the ridge and one covering the creek drainage. The operation had been planned for months. The capture team was professional. They normally worked in East Africa on wildlife translocation projects for conservation programs. Harwick had paid them an extraordinary sum and had provided detailed documentation from his own years of evidence collection in the area of movement patterns, travel corridors, and locations of probable denning and resting activity. He had also arranged for a veterinarian from British Columbia, whose name was never spoken in my presence, to provide the tranquilizer protocol and to be present for the procedure. The veterinarian's involvement was contingent on a guarantee from Harwick that the subject would be kept in conditions sufficient to maintain health and that no permanent harm would come from the procedure. She had been sedated using a dart administered from the helicopter at a range of about 60 feet after the ground team drove her from cover working upwind from the east. Carl said the dart had required a second administration because the first had not been sufficient to fully incapacitate someone of her size, and that she had covered nearly 200 meters between the first and second darts before going down. She had been transported to the barn in a modified stock trailer, unconscious, with the veterinarian monitoring vitals for the 3-hour drive. She had regained consciousness approximately 8 hours after transport in the pen and had tested the perimeter for the better part of the first day, before accepting that the steel plate and pipe gate were not going to yield. 14 months later, she had stopped testing the perimeter in that way. By the time I arrived, she had moved into a different relationship with her confinement, one that had more to do with endurance than with resistance, and I think this was not the capitulation it might look like from outside. I think it was a decision that energy spent on what could not be changed was energy taken from what mattered more. What mattered more, I spent 8 months trying to understand. She ate the food Carl provided in the mornings, before he arrived and before the daytime activity began, in what I understood as a preference for privacy during a vulnerable act. I had read enough about large social mammals in the reading I had been doing since the first month to know that eating in the open is a social act for social animals and a risk management calculation for solitary ones, and what I was watching was a condition in between. A social being forced into solitary conditions who had adapted the social act of eating into a more private act and self-protective. She ate quickly and efficiently and without apparent pleasure, and she was always finished before anyone arrived. She moved differently at different times of night. In the early evening hours, the 2 hours before midnight, she was frequently active, walking the perimeter, engaging in the grooming behaviors I observed that seemed to be a form of self-soothing, making the low, repetitive sounds that I had begun to distinguish from the singing as more functional in character, more meditative. After midnight, the quality of her activity changed. The perimeter walking, when it happened, became more purposeful and less routine. The sounds she made became less frequent and more specific in character, as if the late night was when she was most truly herself rather than most truly a captive. As if the deep darkness in which the industrial barn sounds and the heater, the occasional creak of timber, the distant sounds from the ranch faded to a minimum, was the time she could most nearly approximate the nocturnal awareness she had in the forest. The late night was when she sang. The late night was when she came and sat near me in December. The late night was when the most alive version of her was most accessible, if accessible is even the right word for what I was permitted to witness from my chair 30 feet away. I want to tell you about something that happened in the second week of November, about 3 weeks before the singing, because it reconfigured something essential in my understanding that has not shifted back since. I was sitting in my chair around midnight with my notebook open on the table and the propane heater running and my thermos within reach, and I was writing an entry about the wind pattern that night, which had shifted from the north to the northwest and had brought her to the wall in the way I had been observing. I had the flashlight on the table to supplement the barn's single overhead bulb, angled to illuminate my notebook without pointing toward the pen, standard operating procedure that I had developed in the first week. November was the month when things began to shift between us, and the shift was marked by the sound she made on a rainy Thursday in the second week of November that I will carry for the rest of my life. The rain had been coming in off the Pacific drainage, which in the Okanogan means it had already dropped most of its moisture on the western Cascades and arrived lighter and colder but substantial. It hit the corrugated overhang above the barn's south side at around midnight and ran off in a steady curtain of sound. I was reading. She was in the rain listening posture, upright, hands on knees, face slightly up, eyes closed. The rain had been falling for about 40 minutes. Then she made the sound. It started below what I would call a comfortable frequency. Not so low I couldn't hear it, but low enough that I received it in my chest wall simultaneously with my ears. It built over about 3 seconds until it occupied a range of frequencies I can only describe as a chord. Multiple simultaneous tones in a harmonic relationship, produced by a single source in a way the human voice cannot produce. It sustained for perhaps 12 seconds. Then it softened and faded. I put down my book. I did not pick it up for a long time. I sat in my chair and I thought about what I had just heard and what the correct word was for it, and the word that kept arriving was song. Not a song in any human tradition, not constructed in any musical framework I had a reference for, but a sound made for its own sake. A sound that put what was inside her into the air that had not been there before, and that had the quality I associate with music at its best, the quality of meaning, what was precise to whoever made it, and something more general and less nameable to whoever received it. I believed then, and I believe now, that she was singing a grief song, that in the middle of a November night in a steel pen in an old dairy barn, surrounded by rain and cold and the accumulated weight of 14 months of confinement, she was doing what beings with an interior life do when the interior becomes too large for silence. She was putting it somewhere outside herself, into the air, into the sound, not to communicate, not to be heard, or not primarily, for the same reason a person hums while they work alone, or cries in a place where no one can see them. Because some things need to be expressed even when there is no audience for the expression, because the expression itself is the point. I did not move, I just sat and received it the way you receive what is given freely, which is with stillness and attention, and I let it be what it was. In the second week of December, I arrived for my Thursday night shift and found something on the floor just inside the pen gate. A small arrangement placed against the bars in the only position where it could be pushed through to the outside. The lowest horizontal rail of the gate was about 4 inches above the floor, enough clearance for a hand to reach beneath and deposit an object on the outer side. 4 pine cones arranged in a rough row, a bundle of dried grass, the kind Carl scattered on the pen floor as basic bedding material, and a stone. The stone was about the size of my thumb, oval, flat, dark gray, with a single white mineral vein running through it diagonally. Not distinctive in most respects, the kind of stone that turns up in gravel driveways and creek beds across the inland Northwest. What made it different from any other stone of its description was that someone had kept it. In a pen with no natural ground surface, no creek bed, no gravel, someone had found this stone on the concrete floor, probably kicked in through the drain channel Carl used for washdowns, and had kept it, had held it for some period of time, long enough that when I picked it up it was smooth from handling and faintly warm from a temperature warmer than the air around it, and had now placed it here, against the bars, in the only location where a transfer was possible. I looked at the stone for a long time. Then I looked at her. She was at the far end of the pen, back to me, sitting against the north wall. Her posture was the deliberate neutral I had come to recognize as deliberateness. She was giving me the moment with the stone without the pressure of her attention, giving me space to decide what the stone meant and what I was going to do about it. I crouched down and picked it up, the warmth of it in my palm. I put it in my jacket pocket. The next afternoon before my shift, I stopped at the small market in Concanuli and bought a bag of apples. Not because apples were a sophisticated offering, because they were from outside the barn, a thing that had grown on a tree that carried the quality of sunlight and open air, that was the opposite in nature of concrete and steel plate. Supplemental foods were permitted in the facility protocol Carl had shown me. Apples were on the approved list. I set one just outside the gate where she could reach it through the bars. She did not take it that night. She did not acknowledge it while I was present. When Carl logged the pen the following morning, he wrote that the apple was gone and the subject had consumed it during the early hours. He did not note anything unusual. To Carl, it was a feeding event. He did not know about the stone. That was the beginning of the exchange. The exchange of objects continued, not on any regular schedule, but in a rhythm that felt organic. She left things for me, a piece of smooth wood rubbed against a corner until it was rounded, a dried plant stem braided into a small loop. Once, a pinch of what appeared to be a mineral powder she had somehow extracted from the sediment in the pen's drain channel. A red-orange powder I later identified from a photograph as red ochre, the same iron oxide compound that humans have used for pigment since the earliest archaeological record of human making. I brought her things: apples, a small bundle of cedar sprigs from the tree near the barn's south corner, handfuls of the small flat river stones from a drainage I passed on the drive from Tonasket that were more beautiful than functional and seemed like the right kind of thing to offer. She always received what I brought and responded with an offering in return. Never immediately, never with fanfare. The exchange happened in its own time with no urgency and no performance. Nothing was random, nothing was purely functional. The braided loop made from dried grass was not useful. The red ochre had no apparent purpose in the context of confinement. These were the kinds of objects that beings make and give to each other when they want to say what useful objects cannot say. I do not know what she was saying. I can tell you what I received, which was the sense of being acknowledged as an individual, as a specific person distinct from the other humans who moved through that barn. Being seen, in a context where being seen by anyone was itself remarkable, because what she actually was invisible to everyone around her except in the most superficial physical sense. On a Saturday night in mid-December, her behavior shifted. No exchange had happened that week. I was reading and the barn was quiet except for the heater and the distant wind. At around midnight, she came from the north wall and walked to the side of the pen nearest my chair. Not the gate, but the pipe section closest to me, about 8 feet away. And she sat down on the floor of the pen, not with her back to me, facing me through the pipe. She sat there for the better part of an hour. She did not look at me directly. She did not make any sound. She just sat, facing my general direction, and I sat in my chair facing her general direction, and the hour passed in the warmth from the heater and the quiet of the barn and the very specific quality of peace that comes from being in the presence of another consciousness that is not requiring anything from you. Not performing, not demonstrating, not studying with any particular goal, just present. I did not read during that hour. I held my book, but did not open it. And when, at around 1 in the morning, she stood and walked back to the north wall, I understood that what had just happened was as clear an act of companionship as I had ever been offered. She had come and sat near me not because she needed anything. She had come and sat near me because she had identified me as something she was willing to be near, and being near was itself the point. In a year and a half of captivity, she had arrived by whatever process of evaluation and decision at the conclusion that one human in the barn was worth sitting near for its own sake. I have not received a more straightforward expression of trust in my 77 years. December moved into January. The days had shortened to their minimum and were beginning the incremental recovery toward light. The temperatures in the barn dropped to the low 30s on the coldest nights, even with the propane heating system Harwick had installed. She generated enormous body heat on her own. I measured the air temperature inside the pen with a thermometer from the supply shelf and compared it to the outside air temperature in Harwick's facility log. The differential was consistently between 12 and 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Her body was warming 30 square feet of enclosed space to 15 degrees above ambient air, running on a metabolism built for a different scale of physical demand than a concrete pen would ever impose on it. In January, Harwick brought a researcher. She arrived during my shift, unusual because Harwick's researchers typically worked during the day. She was in her late 30s, methodical, with the practiced impersonality of someone who has learned to move through their professional life without engaging it unnecessarily. She was introduced to me only as Deirdre. She carried a clipboard and a case with equipment I didn't recognize. Harwick told me she would be conducting assessment work requiring the subject in her typical nocturnal behavioral state. He told me to remain at my station and not interfere. The assessment work was a stress response battery, a protocol for measuring physiological and behavioral responses to stimuli under controlled conditions. Each stimulus would be introduced, the subject's response measured, and the elapsed time until return to baseline recorded. The theory I later understood from reading is that recovery time from acute stress provides information about the autonomic nervous system of the subject species. How quickly a being returns to a resting state after a stress event tells you about how that nervous system is organized, a legitimate research method in appropriate contexts. In that barn, in that pen, it was different in kind. The first stimulus was a compressed air horn, the kind sold at sporting goods stores for boating emergencies, designed to produce 115 decibels at close range. Deirdre aimed it through the bars of the gate and discharged it without warning. She moved. She was at the far side of the pen before the sound finished, fast enough that I caught the motion only at the periphery of my vision. A large dark shape resolving to stillness at the back wall before my eyes registered that it was moving. She stood there, and then she turned around. Deirdre was writing on her clipboard. Harwick was monitoring the thermal imaging camera. Neither of them was looking at her face. I was. What was on her face stopped me in a way that I have spent 37 years trying to put language to. It was not rage. Let me say that clearly, because rage would have been simple and I would have understood rage. It was not fear, not the blind animal fear that a sudden overwhelming sound at close range would produce in a captive being with no preparation for it. What was on her face was something quieter and far more difficult to carry. Something I can only describe, trying to be precise, as recognition, not surprise, a knowing sadness, an understanding without remainder. The look of a being who has encountered this before, or enough that is sufficiently close to this, and who has arrived, through whatever process of experience and thought and decision the intervening time has produced, at a place beyond surprise, where the capacity for shock at what humans will do has been exhausted, not bitterness, not the hardened resentment that follows betrayal. Quieter, a clear-eyed knowing. She was looking at Deirdre, and Deirdre was not looking at her, and I was watching both of them, and I understood in that moment the difference between observing and seeing that I have never had to be taught since. Deirdre discharged the air horn a second time, the same result. The fast displacement to the rear, the stop, the turn, the look. This time, Harwick glanced up from the thermal camera and murmured to Deirdre about the subject having acclimated to auditory stimuli. Deirdre wrote on her clipboard they had filed what they had just witnessed, a 7'3" being demonstrating a response to a sudden loud noise that was identical to what a thinking person does when they realize they are being tested and have decided not to perform the expected response. They had filed this under acclimation as a data point about auditory conditioning, and moved on. What I had seen was a choice. She had chosen, in the moment of the first stimulus, not to give them what they were measuring for, not the panic, not the pacing, not the physiological cascade of a stressed captive. She had absorbed the situation, the woman with the clipboard, the device, the compressed air canister, the intent. And she had decided that her response would not be shaped by their expectations, that she would not demonstrate distress for people whose framing of her did not include the possibility that distress was a response she was capable of deciding whether to display or withhold. She retreated quickly and efficiently, minimizing exposure to the stimulus. She turned around, and she looked at the people running the tests with everything she knew about them in her eyes, and she gave them nothing. There were 4 more stimuli that night: a bright light, A metal rod slid through the bars to the pen floor. She stepped back from it without touching it, without investigating it. A live animal in a carrier, which from the smell I identified as a rabbit, introduced into the pen and quickly withdrawn when she showed no response at all. And then the sound. The last stimulus was a recording played from a battery-powered speaker that Harwick positioned against the bars. He pressed play and stepped back, and what came out of that speaker changed everything in the barn in an instant. I do not know where the recording had come from. Harwick had been collecting evidence in the Okanagan Highlands for decades and had correspondents across the cryptobiological research community who traded evidence. Whatever its provenance, what came from that speaker was a vocalization that bore the same fundamental character as the sounds I had been hearing from her in the early morning hours. The same chest origin resonance, the same harmonic structure, the same subsonic component that you receive in your sternum before your ears process it. The moment the recording began, she stopped moving. She was standing near the north wall. She stopped mid-step and her head came up and her entire body oriented toward the speaker the way a compass orients toward a pole. Every muscle, every angle of her frame. The attention was total and immediate in a way that nothing I had observed in 8 weeks of watching had approached. She was not assessing the stimulus, she was receiving it. The way you receive the voice of someone you love across a distance you did not expect to be bridgeable. The recording ran for about 8 seconds. Then it ended, and the silence came back. She made a sound, one sound short, rising at the end in a modulation I had never heard from her before. The sound of a question, the sound of someone calling back to a voice that has gone quiet before they could hear it clearly enough. She held the orientation toward the speaker for 30 seconds after the recording ended. Waiting, nothing came, no answer. The speaker was silent. She sat down on the floor of the pen, drew her knees toward her chest, and turned her back to all of us. Deirdre said something to Harwick about a conspecific vocalization response, and they both wrote things down. They had played her the sound of her own kind and of beings she had not heard in over a year, beings she pressed her palm toward through the steel on North Wine nights, beings she sang grief songs toward in the small hours. They had played it as a test stimulus to measure recovery time, and they had gotten their measurement, though not the one they were expecting, because the measurement they got was the total collapse of the distance she had maintained between herself and everything that had been done to her in this place. The one moment in 8 months when I watched her stop managing herself, when the choice she had been making continuously and deliberately to remain coherent and present and unbroken faltered for 30 seconds under the weight of a voice from home that stopped when she answered it. I sat in my chair and looked at the shape of her back in the far corner of the pen, and I felt a thing I will not make smaller than it was by calling it by its ordinary name. By the time Deirdre came back in February to draw blood and tissue samples from an arm she could reach through the bars with a research-grade collection device, I had already decided. I was working out the when. Carl told me about the February sampling session the following evening. He told it in the same neutral way he told everything. Subject showed mild resistance but was successfully sampled, wound treated, behavioral state, post-session calm. He said the words wound treated, and I looked at the length of white gauze on her arm from elbow to wrist when I went inside, and I looked at her sitting with the wrapped arm flat against the north wall steel, and I said her name. I had been calling her Nell in my notebook for months. It was not a calculated name. My mind had produced it sometime in October when I needed a word for her that was not subject and was not any of the other non-words that Harwick's system offered. I said it out loud for the first time that night. Nell, I said, I am sorry. She turned her head and looked at me. Full eye contact, hell, not the peripheral study she had been using for months. Direct, sustained, the longest eye contact we had exchanged in all my time there, 3 or 4 seconds. Then she looked away. It was enough. I knew what I was going to do. I began working out how. I'm going to tell you what the plan required because the planning mattered, and I want to account for what it took. I have had people tell me over the years that what I did was a spontaneous act of conscience, and that characterization, while flattering in the way that impulsive nobility is always flattering, is not accurate, It was deliberate. It took 4 weeks of preparation. I made specific choices designed to produce a specific outcome. And I want to own that completely because the alternative, the story where a good man simply found himself doing the right thing and was swept along by it, leaves out the part where you have to decide in the cold light of your own reasoning that you are going to act in a way you cannot undo. The variables I needed to control were three: the dogs, the lock on the pen gate, and my own exit from the situation with the minimum possible exposure that would make the cost of releasing her worse than the cost of keeping her confined. Carl kept 2 German shepherds, Rex and Gunner, as perimeter dogs for the overnight shift. He brought them in when I arrived and collected them at 6 in the morning. Both were good working animals, well trained with the solid temperament that German shepherds have when they are raised carefully. Carl had introduced them to me in my first week and had been explicit that feeding them by hand was part of the socialization protocol for all regular overnight staff. Animals trained to alert on strangers needed to know which humans were acceptable, and the feeding was the easiest way. I had been feeding Rex and Gunner by hand for 8 months. They knew my voice, my smell, the sound of my truck arriving on the gravel before I even stepped out. They came to my call. This was not subterfuge. It had been Carl's explicit instruction, but it was also what I would need. The Pengate padlock was case-hardened steel, a master lock that Harwick cycled on the first of every month. Carl's procedure was to stage the new padlock on the supply shelf in its original packaging for the first week of the month before switching it out. The previous month's padlock then went into a small unlocked drawer in the supply shelf cabinet. I had an established reason to access the supply shelf at least twice a week. The thermometer and the log notebook were both stored there. The drawer was a 12-inch additional reach from the shelf itself. I had timed the full motion casually on 2 separate nights in January. 8 seconds from the shelf to the drawer and back in the normal sequence of a supply shelf visit if I moved without hesitation. What I needed was a copy of the key to the previous month's padlock. Padlock keys are shallow-cut keys that any hardware or locksmith operation can copy in 2 minutes. On a Thursday in mid-February during my day off, I drove to a farm supply store in Oroville, 40 miles north of Tonasket on the north end of the Okanagan Valley, far enough from Conconuli that I was not likely to be recognized. And I took the key from the drawer, made the drive, had the copy made, and had the original back in the drawer before Carl arrived at 6 the following morning. I paid cash for the copy. The store clerk was a teenager with no interest in me or my business. The bolt cutters I purchased at the same Oroville farm supply store on a different trip a week later. I told the same teenager I was clearing fence on a property I caretaked. He said that sounded like a lot of work. I agreed that it was. I paid cash. I kept the bolt cutters in my truck cab under the sleeping bag I stored there for winter emergencies, and I drove to the Harwick Ranch every night for 3 weeks with the bolt cutters under the sleeping bag and the copy key in my shirt pocket and waited for the conditions to be right. Those 3 weeks were a particular kind of time. The task was finished and the action was not yet taken, and in between was a condition I do not have a perfect word for. Suspension, maybe, or the held breath of a thing decided but not yet done. I sat in my chair each night with the bolt cutters under the sleeping bag in the truck and the copy key in my shirt pocket, and I did my job. I logged the temperature. I noted her behavioral state. I watched her press her palm against the north wall. On the nights the wind came down from the highlands, and I thought, not yet, and I waited for the right wind. On those nights, knowing what was coming, I watched her differently than I had in any of the previous months. Not with the deliberate observational attention of the early weeks, not with the particular quality of presence that the Stone Exchange and December sitting near had produced. I watched her the way you watch what you are about to lose, with a completeness of attention that loss produces, the quality of looking you apply to things when you understand that you are running out of time in which to look at them. What I saw, watching her that way, was the weight of the 2 years. I had known for months in an abstract way that she was thinner than she had been when she arrived. Carl's feeding logs and my own observation both confirmed it, the narrowing of her frame over the fall and winter in a way that the diet and the containment and the absence of the kind of movement that a body built for real terrain requires could not have avoided producing. Watching her in those 3 weeks, knowing I was watching her for the last time, I saw all of it. The adaptation, the management, the ongoing, continuous daily cost of maintaining herself under conditions that were designed, if not intentionally, then by the nature of what they were, to reduce her. She had not been reduced, but it had cost her, and I could see the cost in those last 3 weeks in a way that I had not let myself see it clearly before, because before there was nothing I could do about it. Now, there was an action I could take. The waiting, I understood, was part of what I was doing about it. I want to explain why the conditions mattered, because I was not waiting on sentiment or superstition. I was waiting on information, specifically on wind direction. I had been tracking her orientation on north wind nights for months, and I understood that when the wind came out of the Okanagan Highlands, she was not sleeping and she was not pacing without purpose. She was standing at the north wall, oriented, attending to whatever the wind carried through the steel from the high country. On northwest wind nights, she was already facing the direction she needed to go, already calibrated to whatever called her from the mountains. I did not want to open a gate for her in a moment of distraction or confusion. I wanted to open a gate for her when she was already ready. I chose a Wednesday in March because Wednesday was Carl's most consistent day. His morning routine on Wednesdays was fixed. A standing obligation in OMAC meant he arrived for his 6 o'clock check with the slight additional pressure of time that shortened his inspection. Not dramatically, but enough that I calculated his departure from the barn would be prompt, giving me a longer window before the next check. The next check after Carl would be around noon, when Harwick's other daytime ranch hand made a general property walk. 6 hours of freedom from discovery. March 9th, 1988 was a clear night, with the temperature dropping to 18 degrees by midnight and a hard northwest wind pushing against the south face of the barn in gusts that made the old timber frame creak. The sky was the kind of winter sky the inland northwest gets when there is no cloud cover and the altitude dries the air until it has no moisture to soften the starlight. Every star individual, sharp, more numerous than they look from the valley floor. I noted all of this on the drive to the ranch. I was calm, not detached, not suppressing anything, genuinely calm, with the particular clarity of having made a decision and committed to it so fully that the anxiety of the undecided phase was behind me. There is a kind of peace that comes from the other side of a hard decision that you have finally stopped trying to avoid, and I had found it somewhere on the drive through the dark valley north of Conconuli. Rex and Gunner met me at the gate as always. I fed them. They ate from my hand and settled in their corner of the outer barn with the ease of animals in established routine. Inside the barn, I sat in my chair. She was at the north wall, palm flat on the steel. The northwest wind had put her there, and she would stay there. And I sat and I watched her, and I thought about nothing in particular for almost 5 hours, which is the most unusual thing I have done in my life, if I am being honest. Sitting in a barn chair watching a being I had known for 8 months, for what I knew was the last time, and finding that I did not need to fill the hours with anything except being there. I had accepted that I could not predict what came after for me. My employment was over the moment I opened the gate. The NDA exposure was real, but manageable. Based on Ralph Dixon's preliminary advice, I had saved enough money to carry me for 3 or 4 months if I was careful. I did not know where I would go or what I would do next, and I had reached a place of peace about not knowing, because the alternative was knowing and staying was the one thing I could no longer do. At 2 in the morning, I got up and went to the supply shelf. I picked up the thermometer. I made a note in Carl's log notebook. Behavioral state, calm, temperature, 28 degrees. I closed the notebook. I opened the drawer. I took the previous month's padlock key and put it in my shirt pocket. I put the thermometer back on the shelf. I carried the notebook to my table. All of this in the normal sequence of my nightly rounds. Nothing different. At 4, I went to my truck. I took the bolt cutters from under the sleeping bag. I walked back to the barn. I placed them on the floor beside my chair and sat down. She was still at the north wall. At 4:45, I stood up and I walked to the pen gate, and I set the bolt cutters on the chain and I cut it 1 cut. The chain fell to the concrete with a sound that was distinct enough in the quiet of the barn that it needed no interpretation, and she turned from the north wall immediately and looked at the gate. I put the bolt cutters on the floor. I took the copy key from my shirt pocket and I put it in the padlock and turned it, and the padlock opened, and I unlatched the gate and I swung it open on its hinges as far as it would go. I stepped back all the way to my chair. I sat down in it. I placed my hands on my knees. I looked at the open gate and the darkness of the barn beyond it, and the outer barn door I had propped with a piece of lumber an hour earlier, as I did on most nights around 2 when the air inside needed circulation. The outer door stood open. The gate stood open. Between her and the night there was nothing except the length of the barn and my presence in a chair off to the side. She did not move immediately. I need to be exact about this because it is the part of the story that I have returned to most often. She was standing at the north wall when I cut the chain. She had turned from the wall when she heard it fall. She had watched me open the gate and step back, and then she stood there for a full 30 seconds, looking at the open gate and at me in my chair, and she did not move. 30 seconds is not a long time in most contexts. In that context, it was long enough for me to wonder, with a brief cold clarity, whether I had misunderstood the fundamental thing, whether she had been in the pen long enough that leaving it was no longer the obvious response I had assumed it was, whether the known space had become, as confinement sometimes does in beings who have been in it long enough, something that felt safer than the unknown beyond it. Then she walked to the gate, at a normal pace, not hurrying, not hesitating, the walk of someone who has decided on a direction and is moving in it without drama. She came through the gate without touching the pipe sides, and she stopped in the main body of the barn, which she had not stood in for nearly 2 years. She was 8 feet away from me. I could hear her breathing. I could feel the radiated warmth of her body from across the space between us. The same warmth that kept the pen 15 degrees above the ambient barn temperature, now in the open air and reaching me in waves. She smelled like everything that had accumulated in the barn for months, and beneath that, the pine and earth character that was specific to her, the forest she had come from, compressed into her hair and her skin. She looked at the outer door. She looked at the night. She took 3 deliberate steps toward the door and stopped. She turned back toward me. I have been asked what that last look contained. I have been asked by Ruth, who listened to the full story one evening in 2012 with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes steady on mine, not flinching at any of it. I have been asked by Connor, who approaches all phenomena with the rigorous skepticism his biology training requires, and who told me when I finished that the rigorous skepticism was not equal to what I was describing. I have been asked by Carl Watkins, who called me in 2008, 20 years after I left the property, to tell me he had been thinking about it and asking whether certain things had happened the way he suspected. What the last look contained, as precisely as I can describe it, was this. She wanted me to know that she saw me, not what I had done for her, though she knew what I had done, me. The specific person sitting in the chair, the one who had received the stone and brought the apple and sat in the barn on rain nights and heard the grief song and not turned away from any of it. She was making sure before she left that I understood I had been known, that the months of careful, peripheral, patient attention had been directed at a specific human being, and that specific human being was being acknowledged before she stepped out of the only context in which any acknowledgement between us was possible. I said, "Go on," out loud. I don't know why those were the words. I hadn't planned to say anything. I just said it. "Go on." She turned. She walked to the outer door. She stepped through the doorway into the dark, and she was gone the way a hand dips below the surface of water, without turbulence, without announcement. One moment she was in the doorway, and the next moment the doorway was empty, and the sound of the wind in the ponderosa was the same sound it had been before. I sat in my chair for another hour. I had not expected to want to sit there, but I did, and I gave myself the time. Then I got up, and I collected my thermos and my notebook and the bolt cutters, and I walked out to my truck. I drove north out of the Okanogan Valley until I was on the other side of the Brewster Bridge, heading east toward Pateros, and when my hands started shaking badly enough to be a road hazard, I pulled over in a gravel turnout above the Columbia River. The river was 40 feet below me in the pre-dawn dark, the water low and black and moving south. I sat in the truck until the shaking stopped, which took about 20 minutes, and then I sat for another hour watching the sky come light over the Waterville Plateau. The sky came light from the east in the way It comes light over that plateau in late winter, not dramatically, not in the sudden burst of color that summer mornings produce, but gradually, a gray becoming a pale gray, becoming a lightning that was more the absence of dark than the presence of light, the stars fading one by one until the sky was a uniform pale that held the day's color just below the surface. I sat and watched it, and I did not think about anything in particular, which was unusual for me. I am a man who has always had thoughts going in the background the way some people have a radio on. That morning the background was quiet. There was nothing to plan. There was nothing to worry about in the productive way that worry sometimes is. There was only the river below me and the sky above and the first light coming up over the Waterville Plateau, and the fact that I had done what I was going to do, and it was done, and she was in the Okanogan Highlands. I thought about her running, or not running, and I did not think she would run. I thought about her walking the way she walked in the barn, the deliberate, unhurried pace of a being who moved with full confidence in the terrain under her feet. I thought about her clearing the county road north of Conconuli, crossing the ditch, moving through the lower Ponderosa into the National Forest timber. I thought about the moment when the country changed from the country she had been looking at through steel walls for 22 months to the country she knew in her body, the country that was inside her as accumulated memory and orientation and the specific kind of belonging that comes from being made for a place. I thought about her reaching it and what that moment would be. When I drove away from the gravel turnout, I was driving toward a life I had not yet figured out. That seemed fine. The morning was clear and cold, and the river was moving south, and I was moving north, and for the first time since September of 1987, the road ahead of me had no weight on the end of it. It did not feel like what I had expected it to feel like. I had expected relief, and what I had instead was a kind of full, quiet exhaustion. The way a muscle feels after it has been doing what it was designed to do for a sustained period and is finally permitted to stop. Harwick called me at 7:15. He had already made his calls and passed through whatever he was going to feel and arrived at the version of himself he had decided to be in this situation. His voice was controlled. He said my employment was terminated effective immediately. He said the NDA remained fully binding. He said if I disclosed information about the facility or released a research animal in violation of his property rights, I faced substantial legal action and potential criminal exposure. He did not specify charges or amounts. I said I understood. He hung up. I went to see Ralph Dixon in Okanogan 4 days later. Ralph read the NDA twice and said the agreement was worded to frighten, that the specific clauses governing my liability were vague in ways that would make enforcement difficult, and that Harwick's ability to pursue action depended entirely on his willingness to produce documentation of what had been held on his property, documentation that would require him to describe in a court proceeding what the thing in the barn was. Ralph said if he comes after you, he has to tell a court what he was keeping. He said Harwick was not going to do that. He was right. The attorney's letter arrived in April, reiterated the NDA terms, and nothing followed. I never heard from Harwick again directly. In the fall of 1988, I was working a concrete job in Omak. A man on the crew named Horace Webb, who had family in the Conconully area, told a story at lunch one day about something his brother-in-law had found on his pasture land northeast of town. He had been checking fence in the spring mud and had found tracks. He initially thought bear, but the tracks were bipedal and too long and too wide for any bear, and they had followed a line out of the timber, crossed the pasture, and gone back into the national forest to the north. He was not a man who told stories like this usually, Horace said. He had brought it up because the size of the prints had genuinely startled him. Conconully is less than 4 miles by road from the Harwick property. The national forest boundary begins at the tree line north and east of town. I ate my lunch and said nothing and thought about the northwest wind and what it means to press your palm against cold steel and feel the call on the other side of it calling you north. I moved to Chelan in the spring of 1989. I had been working construction in the Okanogan Valley and thinking about what I wanted to do that was not construction and not security work and not anything that required me to spend the hours between 10 at night and 6 in the morning sitting in a barn chair. I came through Chelan on the way to look at a job in Wenatchee, and the town stopped me in the way some places stop you when you weren't looking for them to. The drive north through the Okanagan Valley in the late spring of 1989 was the first time since September of '87 that I had driven that road without a destination I was dreading, without the knowledge of what waited at the end of it. The valley looked different driven for my own reasons, and Chelan, when I came down into it from the north on State Route 150, had the quality of an ending that was also a beginning. The lake opening up below the road, blue and enormous and full of light, the orchards on the slopes, the town at the water's edge, with the particular unpretentious solidity of a place that has been doing the same thing for a long time and has no ambition to be anything other than what it is. The lake in May, the hills coming down steep on both sides with the orchards running up them, the smell of apple blossoms off every ridge. It felt like a place where a person could build a life without explanation. I stopped at a hardware store on Wooden Avenue that had a help wanted sign in the window. The man who owned it was named George Barnes, 64 years old, his father's store before him, and his grandfather's concern before that in a different building on the same block. He was looking for someone to learn the business and eventually take it on. We talked for 2 hours. He offered me a job. I started the following Monday. 6 years later, when George was ready to retire, I bought the store from him on a payment structure he arranged with a generosity that I told him was unnecessary and that he told me was exactly necessary because the alternative was selling to a chain, and he was not going to do that while there was a person who understood what the store was. Ruth came into the store in the fall of 1990 to buy a replacement latch for a garden gate. She was 34 years old, a branch librarian at the Chelan County Regional Library, and she had very specific ideas about the correct latch for her gate, and I had not then encountered many customers who knew that much about hardware. We talked for 45 minutes about the latch, and then about orchards, and then about books she had been reading. I asked if she would want to have dinner sometime. She said yes, like it was a reasonable thing to ask, which it was, but sometimes reasonable things feel harder to ask than they should, and it helped that she made it feel reasonable. We were married in August of 1992 in the backyard of her parents' house above the lake. We have 2 sons. Derek is 46 and coaches high school football in Moses Lake. Connor is 43 and teaches biology in Spokane, a combination that produces in me a specific kind of quiet amusement that I keep mostly to myself. Derek became what he became by his own lights, and I am proud of him in the straightforward way a father is proud of a son who figured out what he was built for and went and did it. He was the kind of boy who understood groups, understood how to move in them, lead them, earn their trust, get them to do what they needed to do. He got that from Ruth, I think. I got along with individuals one at a time and always have, and Connor became what he became partly because of a summer in his 14th year when I took him camping in the Okanogan Highlands. 3 days in the backcountry above Salmon Creek. And he found something in the old-growth timber that I recognized and could not name for him without naming everything else. He came home from that trip and started reading field guides. Within a year, he was keeping his own notebooks. He never told me what specifically he had felt up there, and I never asked because some things in families are better communicated sideways. We have 3 grandchildren. The life built from the years after March of 1988 has been a full life, and I am grateful for it without reservation. But I want to go back to the barn one more time because there is a night I have not yet told you about that belongs at the center of this story. A night in mid-November, about 3 weeks before the singing, when something happened that I have spent 37 years carrying, and that explains more than anything else I have described, why I was able to open that gate and not look back. I was writing when I became aware that she had stopped pacing. The sound of her circuit, the soft, deliberate footfalls on the concrete, the slight creak of the pen's pipe structure when she turned at the corners, had been part of the ambient environment for the previous 2 hours, and its absence registered the way any absent sound registers, as a change in the quality of the space that requires a check. I looked up. She was standing in the middle of the pen, approximately 15 feet from the gate, facing me directly. Not the side of the gaze study I had become accustomed to. Facing me fully, standing still, looking at me with an openness and directness that was so different From anything she had previously allowed that it took me a moment to understand what I was looking at, I did not move. I set my pen down very slowly. I matched her stillness, and I looked back. I have tried to explain what those minutes contained, not the emotional content. The emotional content is easy to name. It was overwhelming in the specific way that overwhelming things arrive when you are not braced for them. What I have tried to explain to the people I have told this to is the quality of the looking itself. She was looking at me as an equal looks at an equal, not with familiarity, not with warmth, not with any of the comfortable markers of a relationship at ease, with a clear, complex, specific attention that contained more information about what I was and who I was than I could process in the time available. It was not like being looked at by an animal. It was not like being looked at by a person in the ordinary sense. It was like being looked at by a being that saw more than any instrument I had encountered could measure. And that was deciding in real time what to do with what it was seeing. The mutual looking lasted, I think, about 2 minutes. It might have been longer. Then she turned very slowly and walked back to the north wall, and the circuit resumed, and the barn returned to its ordinary sounds. I sat with my pen in my hand and my notebook open on the table, and I did not write anything for about 20 minutes. When I finally wrote, what I put down was this: she looked at me tonight as if she had made a decision about me. I don't know what the decision was, but something changed. Looking back from 37 years away, I think the decision was to proceed with the stone, to move from the indirect study of a being she was still calibrating into an acknowledgement that the calibration was complete and had produced a result she could act on. The stone came 3 weeks later. But the decision, I believe, was made in that barn in mid-November with 2 minutes of mutual looking that neither of us looked away from. What I have never stopped being grateful for is that I stayed in the chair, that I matched her stillness and held her gaze and did not blink first. Not because I was brave. I was not particularly brave in those minutes. I was mostly managing a thing that was happening to me, but because staying still was the right response and I had enough sense to do it, and it was enough. I want to tell you what I came to understand about the mechanics of her captivity in the plainest terms I can manage, because I think it is important to say it plainly. She was intelligent, not approximately intelligent, not intelligent in a limited or qualified sense. Intelligent in the full, specific, active sense of the word, capable of learning, of planning, of communication, of the kind of empathic attunement to another being's emotional state that most humans consider the exclusive province of our species. She had demonstrated all of these things to me over 8 months in circumstances that were specifically designed, if not intentionally, then structurally, to suppress them. She was intelligent in conditions that gave her intelligence almost nothing to act on, and she had found the available material and acted on it anyway. The stone, the braided loop, the 2 minutes of mutual looking, the sitting near me in December, the choice in January not to perform her distress for Deirdre's clipboard. All of this was the exercise of a mind that had been given very nearly nothing to work with and had worked with it. I have thought about what that intelligence required to sustain, what it cost her to stay curious, to stay engaged, to keep reaching toward communication across a boundary that should have made communication impossible, in circumstances that would have extinguished the effort in a less determined being. The answer I have arrived at over 37 years is that it required what I have come to think of as her deepest nature. Not willpower in the human sense. Willpower is a thing you apply against resistance, and what she demonstrated was not effort against resistance, but the natural expression of what she fundamentally was. She was curious the way a river is in motion. She communicated the way a tree grows toward light, not with effort, by nature. This is what I mean when I say she was not broken. Not that she was unaffected, and she had been affected profoundly, and the effects were visible in every modification of natural behavior that confinement required, in every north wall pressing and every grief song and every muted response to a stress battery that should have produced a cascade of distress. But the deepest current of what she was ran underneath all of that, uninterrupted, and it is that current that I mean when I say she remained herself. The deepest thing in her was intact when she walked out of that barn. And I believe, without any specific evidence, but with the confidence of someone who knew her well enough to make the claim, that it was intact when she pressed her palm against the north wall on the nights the wind came from the highlands, that it was always intact, that they could have kept her there for 10 years and it would still have been intact because some things are not maintained by effort, some things simply are. I have tried to apply this understanding to my own life with, as I said, mixed results. I have had easier times maintaining it in some circumstances than others, but the standard is there because I watched it enacted, and it does not go away. Now let me tell you about what happened in the years between the barn and the return to the highlands, because those years are part of the story, even though they were ordinary years by most measures, and I do not want to give the impression that what happened in March of 1988 produced in me a person who moved through the subsequent decades in a state of continuous illumination. I was not illuminated. I was Earl Cooper, hardware store man, youth baseball coach, husband, father, ordinary person of the kind that every community needs more of and does not always have enough of. I had the ordinary difficulties of an ordinary life. Money tight in some years, health concerns in my 50s, the complicated feelings that come with watching your parents age and then lose them, the ongoing negotiation between what you want your life to be and what it actually is. None of this was touched by what had happened in the barn in any dramatic way. The barn was a thing I carried, not a thing I advertised, but it was there. It was always there in the way that formative experiences are always there, not as an intrusion into ordinary life, but as a frame for it. When I coached youth baseball and one of my players, a 12-year-old named Greg, who was afraid of everything and who I spent 2 seasons helping not be afraid of everything, finally stood in at the plate in a crucial situation and hit the ball. It was not that experience that I thought of in the moment, but the understanding I applied to Greg, the understanding that the fear and the capability exist simultaneously in a person, and that the job is to stay present to the capability rather than to the fear. That understanding came from somewhere. I know where it came from. I had watched a being in a steel pen stay present to her capability for 8 months, under conditions that would have made fear the only reasonable response. When I had disagreements with George Barnes in the years when I was learning the hardware store and George had his fixed ideas about how things should be done, and I had my own fixed ideas about how they should be done differently, the patience I applied to those disagreements came from somewhere too. I had watched a being communicate across a species boundary using objects and sitting near someone, and 2 minutes of mutual looking. I had learned a specific form of patience from that, not what patience looks like from the outside, which most people already know, what patience feels like from the inside when you are the one applying it, not passive, not merely waiting, but active and alive and fully present to the process of letting understanding develop at the pace it actually develops rather than the pace you want it to. These are small examples. I do not want to overdraw the line between what happened in the barn and how I subsequently lived, but the line is there and I want to acknowledge that it is there rather than pretend that what I witnessed in 1987 and 88 was contained to the duration of its happening. It was not contained. It opened a capacity in me that stayed open. When I told Connor the full story on the porch in 2019, he was 43 years old and had been a biology teacher for 15 years and had the trained skepticism of a man who understands exactly what claims of the extraordinary require in order to be taken seriously. He listened to everything. He asked clarifying questions, not to challenge the account, but to understand the specific evidence. When I described the vocalization she made, the night of Deirdre's stress battery, and the one that rose at the end in the shape of a question directed at the speaker that had just gone quiet, Connor asked whether I was certain the modulation was intentional rather than automatic, whether I had any basis for distinguishing a deliberate communicative act from a reflexive physiological response to the recorded sound. I told him that I was certain, not through any technical analysis, but through 8 months of learning to distinguish the two in a specific individual. I told him that the sounds she made reflexively and the sounds she made intentionally had different qualities, different timing, different relationships to what was happening in the room, and that by January I knew the difference the way you know the difference between the sounds a person makes in their sleep and the sounds they make when they are choosing to speak. I told him that the January sound was a choice. He sat with that for a while. Then he said, "That is exactly the kind of thing a peer-reviewed paper cannot use, and exactly the kind of thing that matters most." He said, "I believe you, Dad. I believe you completely. I have thought about those words often. Not because they resolved anything. They did not resolve anything. The evidence I carry is not the kind of evidence that resolves questions in the scientific sense, but because they gave me a context for understanding what this story is and is not. It is not a scientific paper. It is not a legal filing. It is a testimony, the testimony of a specific person who was in a specific place at a specific time and paid as close attention as he was capable of paying to what was in front of him, and who is now telling what he saw as clearly and honestly as language permits. That is all it is. That is what it deserves to be. Let me tell you about the years between 2011, when the facility was demolished, and 2019, when I told Connor, because those years had a particular quality that I think is part of the honest shape of the story. They were years in which I knew with increasing certainty that Gerald Harwick's death had changed the practical landscape of what I was permitted to do with what I knew. The principal party who had most to lose from my disclosure was gone. His son had no investment in the secret. The facility was erased. The non-disclosure agreement's principal enforcer was dead. And yet for 8 years I continued to carry the story the way I had carried it for the previous 23. Not from fear, from the durable force of habit, the habit of secrecy, which is one of the most durable habits a person can develop. I had been carrying it for 31 years at that point. 31 years of it sitting in the top drawer of my nightstand, not just the key, which was the physical object, but the whole weight of the experience, which had nowhere to go except around inside me, and which I had become very practiced at not letting show. Ruth knew the shape of it. She knew there was a thing I was carrying, and she had known since before we married that the thing was real and was significant and would be shared when I was ready. She waited without pushing, which is one of the many things about her that I am grateful for. When I finally told her in 2012, the relief of it was physical, like setting down a weight you had carried so long you had forgotten it was heavy. Ruth listened to the whole story in a single evening. We were in the kitchen after dinner, the kind of quiet evening that becomes available when your children are grown and out of the house and the phone has stopped ringing. I told it in the order it happened, starting with Carl's lunch invitation in Tonasket and ending at the Brewster Bridge in the pre-dawn light. I did not soften anything. I included Deirdre's stress battery and the air horn. I included the sound she made when she heard the recording of her own kind. I included the thing I had seen on her face that night that I had spent 24 years trying to put language to, and that I told Ruth was the most accurate and devastating thing I had ever witnessed a living being do. Ruth listened without interrupting. She has the kind of listening that feels like being taken seriously, which is a specific gift that not everyone has and which I have never taken for granted. When I finished, she sat for a while without speaking. Then she asked me one question. She asked whether I thought she was still alive. I told her I did not know for certain. I told her I believed she was, based on the evidence that she had gone back to a community and that the community had immediately adapted its behavior to avoid a second capture. I told her that the vocalization I had heard in 2023 and the one from northeast of the clearing, a quarter-mile away in the old growth that I had received in my sternum before I received it in my ears, was as close to confirmation as I was likely to get, and that I was at peace with it being as close as I would get, that it was enough. Ruth said, "It was her, wasn't it?" Not a question. I said I believed it was someone from the same community, which might or might not be her specifically. Ruth said, "It was her." She said it with the certainty that people who trust their own reading of things speak with, and I have not argued with it since. There is a thing that happens when you carry a secret for a very long time. The secret becomes part of your architecture. It is not separate from you anymore. It is one of the load-bearing elements of the structure you inhabit, and you have organized everything else around it. When I finally told Ruth, I did not experience the sudden weightlessness that the metaphor of a burden lifted implies. What I experienced was a rearrangement. The load-bearing element was not removed, it was shared. Ruth could now hold part of the weight, which meant I was holding less, which meant the structure could stand more easily. But the secret did not dissolve. It never has. It sits in me still, a part of who I am, a part of what I know, a part of how I understand the world that I will carry until I no longer have the capacity to carry anything. The difference now is that it is no longer only mine. There is one more thing I need to tell you before I bring this to its close, and it concerns Gerald Harwick in a way that is difficult to frame without seeming either to excuse him too much or to condemn him too simply. I have thought about it for 37 years, and I am going to say it as plainly as I can. Harwick spent the last decade of his life in a condition I can only describe as a kind of grief. Not for what he had done to her. I do not think he ever arrived at a full accounting of that, because arriving at a full accounting would have required dismantling the framework through which he understood his own life's work. And that is the kind of dismantling that most people cannot do voluntarily, not without a framework to replace it. What he grieved, I believe, was the failure of the project itself. He had achieved the capture. He had the specimen. And instead of the proof he had spent 20 years trying to produce, instead of the scientific vindication that would have retroactively justified everything he had done, he had a being in a pen who would not cooperate with being studied in the way that producing such proof required. She would not panic on schedule. She would not display the fear responses his behavioral protocols were designed to measure. She would not perform her own distress for his instruments. And without that cooperation, without the data that required her active response to stimuli, he had very little of scientific utility except the fact of her existence, which he could not present to anyone without revealing how he had obtained her. Ruth knows this story. She is one of 3 people I have told it to in full. The other 2 are Ralph Dixon, who heard it in the context of the legal question in 1988 and who has since died, and my son Connor, who I told in 2019 when he visited and we sat on the porch above the lake. Connor is the one who asked the question that gets to the center of what this is actually about. He had been listening for a particular thing, and when I finished, he said, "Dad, what did she tell you about us?" I had mentioned it in passing that what I had learned in that barn was as much about human beings as about her, and he wanted me to explain what I meant. It is the question I want to answer as precisely as I can because it is the center of what I actually learned. What she told me about us was visible in the aggregate of 8 months of nightly watching, in the cumulative evidence of what she chose and did not choose, noticed and did not notice, performed and refused to perform. It was not a message in any decodable sense. It was not a lesson she intended to teach. It was what I could see from the specific vantage point of the chair by the barn door, watching a being who was simultaneously experiencing the worst of what humans were capable of and deciding continuously and deliberately how she was going to meet it. The specific moment I come back to most is the stress battery, Deirdre with her clipboard, Harwick with his thermal camera, the air horn at close range, and what she chose to do with her response. She had been in the pen for 14 months by then. She had been sedated and transported and tested and sampled and observed and logged. She had been given enough care to sustain her physical health and not enough of anything else to do much with. She had pressed her palms against the north wall on cold nights for over a year. She had heard the recorded voice of her own kind played at her as a measurement tool. She had been through everything the situation could produce, and what she had arrived at on the far side of all of it was not broken. She was not broken. And when Deirdre introduced the air horn, she made a choice. She chose not to give them the demonstration, not the panic, not the pacing, not the physiological cascade of a stressed captive. She did the minimum, the necessary retreat from a painful stimulus, and then she turned around and she looked at the people doing this to her with everything she knew about what they were, and she withheld from them the proof of distress that would have told them they had gotten inside her. Because they had not gotten inside her. Because she had decided at some point in 14 months of captivity that what was hers to keep was hers to keep regardless of what could be taken from her, and that the innermost part of herself was in that category. They could take her territory and her freedom and her contact with her own kind and 2 years of her life. They could not take the thing she had decided to protect. She was not going to perform her own pain for their data. That is what she told me about us. That we are a species that will do this, will put a living being in a steel pen and study its suffering and call it research, and that a being of sufficient intelligence and character will look directly at that fact, know exactly what it is without the comfort of not knowing, and choose not to become what that fact suggests it should become. She chose not to be defined by what was being done to her. She remained who she was, in circumstances that would have worn most humans I know down into something smaller and more afraid and more bitter. She stayed whole. That is the most important thing I have ever watched a living being do. And it happened in a 30 by 30-foot steel pen in an old dairy barn on a ranch in Okanogan County, Washington, witnessed by one man sitting in a folding chair with a thermos of coffee and a composition notebook. And the only reason I know about it is that I was there and I was paying attention. I have tried to carry the lesson. I have managed it imperfectly, and I will keep trying. I want to tell you about Gerald Harwick's final years, not because the information changes what happened in the barn, but because it is part of the honest shape of the story. Carl Watkins told me in a phone call 6 months after my termination that Harwick had spent the better part of March and April of 1988 attempting to reacquire a subject. He said Harwick had contacted the capture team again and authorized a second attempt, this time further east in the national forest above the Okanogan River. The attempt was made in June of that year. A helicopter deployed the net and tranquilizer system in place. It failed. Carl said the capture team had reported that the target species had demonstrated an awareness of the helicopter approach that was inconsistent with their prior capture experience, and they were not willing to make a third attempt at the proposed rate. What I take from this, and I acknowledge it is interpretation, not fact, is that she had gone back to whatever community she had come from, and she had told them. She had communicated something that made the beings she found there aware of the helicopter and the net in a way they had not been before. She had taken what she had learned in 22 months of captivity about human methods and human machinery and human intent, and she had put it into whatever language her kind shared, and they had heard it, and they had adjusted. She had brought something back. Whatever the 2 years cost her, she had not come home empty. He had caught the thing he spent his life chasing, and it had told him in the clearest possible terms that catching it was not going to give him what he thought it would. The proof he needed was locked inside a being who had looked at his instruments and his clipboards and his researchers and decided, with the full intelligence that should have been his proof if he had been capable of recognizing it for what it was, not to cooperate. His proof was her refusal to be his proof. The intelligence was the evidence, and the evidence was the refusal. He could not see it because he had spent so long defining the intelligence of this species in terms of what it should do, when studied, that he could not process what it actually did instead. I do not know whether anyone else in Harwick's position would have seen it differently. I suspect most would not. I suspect what I was able to see from my chair in the barn with my composition notebook and my 8 months of nightly observation was only possible because I was not the one whose lifetime's work was riding on the outcome. I had nothing invested in what she was or was not. I had only attention, and attention, unencumbered by investment in a particular answer, occasionally produces understanding that investment cannot reach. Harwick redirected his research program away from live capture and toward evidence collection in the years that followed. Carl told me in the few times we spoke over the years that Harwick had spent his final decade compiling a database of sighting reports and physical evidence from the Okanogan region, footprint casts, audio recordings, photographic evidence that he had apparently intended to publish and never did. Whether he ran out of time or out of certainty, I don't know. He died of a stroke in February of 2011, alone in the ranch house with whatever he had been building for 30 years still in his files. Carl Watkins called me in 2008, 20 years after I left the property, carrying something he had been sitting on for years. His wife had recently died, and he was living alone in Tonasket and had been going through old things in his house and had found his copies of the behavioral log notebooks from the facility. He said he had read them all the way through for the first time. He said reading them had made him feel sick. He said he had spent 5 years filling in a log that said absolutely nothing true about what was actually happening in front of him, and he needed to tell someone who would understand what that meant. We talked for over an hour. I told him about the stone and the apple, about the singing, about the rain listening and the north wall pressing, about Deirdre's stress battery and the look on her face after the air horn, about the last look at the gate. Carl was quiet through most of it. When I finished, he said, "I could tell what was happening between you two. I could tell something was different about how the pen felt on mornings after your shifts compared to nights with Carl alone." He said, "I'm glad you opened the gate. I should have told you that a long time ago. Earl, I'm glad you did it." Carl died the following spring. I drove up to Tonasket for the service. He was a careful man, and he deserved to be seen off by someone who had been in the barn with him. I have thought about Carl often in the years since. He was not a complicated man, and I do not want to make him one, retroactively. He was a working ranch hand who did his job carefully and kept his own counsel and did not ask more of any situation than was being offered. But he was also a man who spent 5 years logging the behavioral state of a being whose real behavioral state was entirely invisible to the categories his log provided, and who then read those logs decades later and felt sick about it. Not ashamed of not knowing, but sick about the gap between the log and the reality, the way a person feels sick when they understand that the record of their presence somewhere does not contain anything true about what was actually there. The phone call he made in 2008 was the thing I would have done in his position. I knew that about him in the time we worked together, knew it, the way you know things about people when you share a location and a responsibility in the early mornings and the irregular hours. Carl was not a person who would have opened the gate. He was a person who would have called 20 years later to say that he was glad someone did. There is a category of people like that, and they are not lesser people for it. The willingness to call is a form of courage that does not get named the way the willingness to act does, but it is a form of courage. He needed me to know that he had been thinking about it, that it had stayed with him. I am grateful he picked up the phone. In the spring of 2023, I drove up into the Okanogan Highlands. Ruth packed me a thermos of coffee and a sandwich and told me to take my time. I drove north through Omak, east through Okanogan on State Route 215, north through Concanully, past the town, past the turnoff that used to lead to Harwick's property, the gravel road that branches east toward the Salmon Creek drainage, the road I had driven 6 nights a week for 8 months in the dark. The field where the barn had been is just a field now. I did not stop there. I kept going north on the county road that climbs above the creek into the denser timber. I parked where the maintained road ends, and I walked from there. I followed a deer trail that climbed east toward the ridge above the creek drainage. The timber changed as I gained elevation, the ponderosa pines of the lower slopes giving way to Douglas fir, and then in the moister draws where snow had persisted longest to a mix of Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir. The air smelled like warming pitch, and the cool that still lived in the snow shadows, and underneath that, the mineral, clean smell of running water somewhere below in the drainage. I walked for about 2 hours. The trail dissolved into deer paths and then into open timber where the ground was a century of accumulated needles, soft enough that my steps made almost no sound. I was moving in the general direction of the country where the Harwick property's north fence line ended and the national forest began. The country that she had pressed her palm toward on cold nights for a year and a half. I had not been in the Okanogan Highlands since the fall of 1988, the year I worked construction in Omak and ate lunch with Horace Webb and heard about the tracks in the pasture northeast of Concanully. 35 years, the country looked the same and did not look the same in the way that country you have not seen for most of a lifetime looks, recognizable in its large features, changed in details that take a moment to inventory. The ponderosa pines I remembered as substantial were now enormous, 3 feet and more in diameter, the kind of slow accumulation of years that you have to leave a place to notice because if you are always there, the change is invisible. The understory had shifted in the draw I was climbing through, more Douglas fir than I remembered, which the fire history of the last 30 years probably explained. But the fundamental character was the same. The quality of the air was the same. The way the ground held your weight in the softness of accumulated needles was the same. Some things do not change at the pace that takes a human lifetime to traverse. I was thinking about her as I walked, not with active deliberation, not constructing arguments or composing thoughts, just carrying her the way I had carried her for 37 years as a presence in the back of my mind that was always there when I was quiet enough to feel it. The stone was in my jacket pocket, where it had lived for 37 years. I had taken it out and held it on the drive from Chelan, while Ruth drove, and I sat in the passenger seat and turned it over in my fingers in the way I had turned it over 10,000 times. The white diagonal vein through the gray. The smooth oval that handling makes when enough hands hold a thing for long enough. I had not decided on the walk from the truck that I was going to leave it. The decision arrived somewhere in the second hour, in the way that decisions that have been forming a long time arrive when you finally provide them the right condition. Not with drama, not with the feeling of having chosen, but with the simple clarity of having arrived at the only thing that made sense. I found a natural clearing on the upper slope where a cluster of boulders had tumbled off the ridge at some point in the geological past and settled into a rough arrangement. The largest offered a flat surface about waist high. I sat down. I opened the thermos and drank some coffee. The clearing was maybe 30 feet across. The timber around it was old growth on the north and east sides. Ponderosa pine 3 and 4 feet in diameter, bark plating deeply furrowed, the lower branches long dead and gone, the canopy high enough that the late morning light came through in long shafts that moved slowly across the ground as the sun climbed. I sat for about an hour. The wind moved through the high branches. A Clark's nutcracker worked somewhere above me on the ridge, its mechanical cry coming and going. A raven called twice from the south and was not answered. I drank my coffee and I thought about nothing in particular, which is a skill I have developed over 77 years of having thoughts and finding that the thoughts are sometimes less useful than the silence between them. Then, from somewhere northeast of where I was sitting, between a quarter mile and half a mile, given how the sound moved through the old growth and the draw below, I heard a vocalization. It was brief, maybe 4 seconds. Low, moving through a frequency range that included at least one component I received in my sternum a fraction of a second before I received it in my ears, the way the sound traveled the bones of my chest wall before the airborne portion arrived at my eardrums. I had heard it before, not this instance of it, but the shape of it, the harmonic structure, the quality of being produced by something that generates sound at a scale and in a way that human anatomy cannot replicate. I had heard it in a barn in the small hours of rainy mornings in 1987. I sat without moving. I did not call back. I did not make any sound. I let the clearing return to its own sounds, the wind, the nutcracker, the creek below, the slow random creak of old trees adjusting to the temperature. And I sat in the middle of all of it, and I breathed, and I let what had just happened settle. After a while, I reached into my jacket pocket. The stone was there as it had been for 37 years. I took it out and held it in my palm, the white vein through the gray, the smooth oval feel of it, the weight that was familiar in a way that no object except the most carried ones ever becomes familiar. I sat with it for a minute, just feeling it. Then I placed it on the flat top of the boulder beside me. I put my hand on it for one more moment, then I stood up and I walked back down the trail to my truck. I don't know if anyone found it. I don't know if there is a being in those mountains who would find a gray stone placed on a rock in a clearing above Salmon Creek and know what it meant or who left it. I'm not certain what I meant by leaving it, the fact of having kept it, the weight of 37 years and the particular lightness of putting it down in the place where it had always probably belonged, the best I had to offer in the absence of any other language. My name is Earl Cooper. I was born in Brewster, Washington on March 2nd, 1948. I grew up in the orchards in the Columbia River country, and I worked construction for 20 years and ran a hardware store for 22 more and coached youth baseball for 12. And I have been married to the same woman for over 30 years, and I have lived a good life built from reliable materials and patient effort. What none of that explains is the key in my nightstand drawer. The key on the leather cord with the notch cut near the bow. What none of that explains is 8 months in a dairy barn in Okanagan County in the company of a being that no scientific institution in this country will formally confirm exists, watching her make a choice every night to remain who she was in the face of everything that had been done to her. Watching her sit near me on a December night for no reason except that being near was the point. Watching her sing grief songs into the cold air at 4 in the morning. watching her press her palm against the north wall, steel, and keep the line open to whatever called her from the mountains. Watching her turn one last time at the open door of the barn to make sure I knew I had been known. I opened the gate. I would open it again tomorrow. I would open it 1,000 times. The key is still in the nightstand drawer. It still has the notch cut near the bow so you can find it in the dark. Ruth knows it is there. She has never asked me to get rid of it, and I have never offered to. Some things need to be kept. Some things you carry not as a burden, but as a record. Proof that a specific thing happened, that a specific person sat in a specific chair and paid attention and eventually did the one thing he had the power to do. The stone is on a boulder on a ridge above Salmon Creek in the country north of Concanully, in the Okanagan Highlands, in the part of Washington state where the ponderosa pine runs east until it meets the Kettle River Range, and the country above the river has been unchanged in any way that matters since before the first road was run through it, in the country that was hers before any deed was recorded for it or any name put on any map of it. Somewhere in those mountains, in the timber that does not see a logging road for 15 or 20 miles in the right direction, in the old-growth draws where the snow stays late and the ground is soft with centuries of needles, somewhere in there are beings that the world insists do not exist. They have been there longer than the county roads and the county itself and any name that any settler put on any piece of the land they live in. They have been pressing their palms against the cold faces of north-facing rocks and reading what the wind carries and calling to each other across distances that make human shouting range seem like a whisper. And they have been doing all of this in careful, patient, enormous silence, not because they have nothing to say, because they understood a very long time ago what acknowledgement would cost them, and they have done the math, and they have decided to remain what they were before we arrived. I find this both heartbreaking and right, and I have made my peace with the fact that it can be both things simultaneously and that holding the two together without resolving them is not confusion, but clarity. They are there. What I put back into those mountains on the 9th of March, 1988 is part of what they carry now. The knowledge of one human being who sat in a barn chair all winter and learned something true, and who used the two keys on the leather cord the way they should have been used from the beginning. I hope the wind carries it forward. I hope she told them. I hope the lesson passed. I have made peace with the fact that I will never know for certain. I will never know whether she reached her territory in those first hours, whether the community she had come from was still in the same range, whether the 22 months changed her relationship to that community in ways that made the return complicated rather than simple. I will never know how long she lived after 1988, or whether the vocalization I heard from a quarter-mile northeast of a boulder clearing in the spring of 2023 was hers or belonged to one of whatever generation came after. These are things I do not know and will not know and have accepted not knowing, the way you accept not knowing the things about the people you love that they never told you, not because those things don't matter, but because your love doesn't require them. I loved what I knew of her, the stone, the sitting near, the thing she chose not to give Deirdre. The last look at the open barn door. That is enough to carry, that is enough to place carefully on a boulder above a creek and walk away from. I hope she made it home.